Other data to review other than demographics.
To the extent possible, I would say if there is data available from Act 46 consolidation to what, I think that's been a struggle all along. There's a lot of anecdotal data.
Peter, that's part of the problem. We don't have any analysis of Act 46. But that's just that's my perspective. We're not going to get it, right? We're not going to do that.
Yeah, I guess the question is, to what extent do we sort of say anecdotes are data? I'm always a little hesitant about that, but there's certainly plenty out there. And you're absolutely right. It is very hard to analyze sort of cost savings when cost savings are usually redirected to investment in other areas of a school district.
Yeah, and there's just a lot of other variables that have taken place over the last 10 years, right, that have influenced spending.
I think too, I know that we as a commission have defined the term equity, but when I hear comments from members of the public, we're talking about creating larger structures to have more equitable opportunities in terms of academic offerings for students. But yet you hear parents say, now I'm looking at having to drive my kid or having my kid be on a bus an hour each way. We won't have access to extracurriculars. My kid is going to be on the outside instead of, part of the school community because we live so far away. So, that's not part of our definition of equity, but I think, when we think about what are we hoping to gain by reducing the number of districts and increasing equitable opportunities for students, that is something that resonates with me, because obviously we want kids to have greater academic opportunities, but we also want them to feel like they're able to fully engage with every aspect of the school community. So, I guess back to the question of what data should we review. I don't know if there's a way to look into that other than what we're hearing from parents. But I don't know if there's school data that we could look at that would bear that out or not.
Yeah, I wonder. It is always a question of what data is actually readily available. But when we think about it, especially in the upper grades, even just we want to narrow it to high school, to what extent due to smaller districts are secondary students having disparate experiences. So it'd be really sort of a look at opportunities and offerings at larger secondary schools and smaller secondary schools. And again, since we're the governance subcommittee, it seems to me the tie there is, can the benefit of larger district governance lead to more opportunity for students? And I can certainly point to areas where I could say it might or it could.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say also to the extent possible, although this is really more into quality than governance, to what extent are, and of course it's hard to get data about very small schools because it's all suppressed, but is there a significant difference to the extent possible in student outcomes based on size of district?
In terms of outcomes, are you thinking test scores, college acceptance?
Not college acceptance, but I would say, test scores to the extent that it's possible. Mary Gannon, I think you are not muted, so we're hearing you type a lot.
My apologies. So sorry.
If I can just add, I certainly feel that looking at assessment results by school to try to assess whether there's any correlation between size is important. I think it's also important that when we do something like that, we're looking at all the variables. So it's not necessarily size. Sometimes it is the largest variable, but it's the socioeconomic profile of a community. So you could have, a school of 55 students, but, from a more affluent community doing extremely well compared to a school of, 80 students from a school that had district that typically has 80, 90% poverty, that's going to have very different results.
Okay, so far, just to review what we have, what data should we review? Demographic data, data to the extent that it exists from Act 46 consolidation with some recognition that maybe anecdotal comments might be what we are left with, and test scores. And then it's important to compare not just the test scores to see if there's a correlation between the size and score, but also to look at all underlying variables.
Yeah, I think certainly looking at staffing ratios by size, I think is important.
Is this under test scores or just in general?
No, just that's in general. If we're looking at governance, is there any, again, relationship between size of governance and staffing patterns? Again, I think, these are those things that sometimes, I look at numbers and narratives. Sometimes there is a perception, right, that small schools spend more or small schools have smaller class sizes. And that may be true in some cases and may not be true in other cases. And so having accurate data to really look at that, I think, is important. And I think that's hard data. I don't know that that's readily available and easy to access from the agency, but that's probably the place that we would have to ask for it.
Well, and I think it would be really important too to consider, I mean, when you say, small schools spend more per student, what particular data are we looking at to determine that? And, here's a for instance. So I live in a small town, right? We have 200 students plus or minus. I mean, it varies from 180 to, during the pandemic it was 240. I mean, that was a significant, by percentage, that was a huge increase. And the problem is, for students that aren't captured in the budget in year one, they get rolled into the budget in year two because we have to retroactively pay for them. So in year two, it looks like our per pupil spending is astronomical, because we are basically paying twice for the same student, once for year one and once when they get rolled into year two. But in reality, we're not spending that much on any student. It's just, what we have to do to balance the budget. So, just kind of keeping that reality in the back of my head, like, how do we actually look at the price or the cost per pupil? Because it's not just, what the tax rate would show you. And maybe that's a question for Peter. I just want to make sure.
There's an equal challenge in that, the school district I live in has 6 small schools, but there's one budget for the entire district. And I'm not quite sure how you break down per pupil spending on a school basis. It's even more challenging there.
So how do we figure that out? Like, is there a way to get?
I think it's again, all data has to come from the AOE to the extent that they have it. And so it would need to be presented to us in such a way that we understand all of the, caveats that come with it.
I'm just thinking, if we ask the AOE, I want to be careful that we're asking for what we're actually hoping to get.
Right.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really challenging is that we are so stuck on spending per pupil as a measure. And for right or wrong, that's kind of the construct that we've established and we've identified. But what happens, the spending per pupil can change more dramatically in a small school with a smaller, change in the population. And what happens is typically staffing lags behind in terms of reduction in staff. And so it sometimes takes a school 3, 4, 5, 6 years of declining enrollment before they move from, two classrooms per grade to one classroom per grade, or moving from single age grouping to multi-age grouping. So oftentimes small schools are on this bubble, right, where you're declining in your enrollment and you're making adjustments, but your spending per pupil is rising much quicker than your ability to change. And so you have to almost wait until it gets worse, right, to aggregate that impact and then make the change. And so that's sort of a nuance to all of this. It's just really hard to understand. People just say, look, your school is spending X per pupil, whereas the reality is 6 years ago, you were really right in the middle of the pack and reasonable. It's just that you've had this precipitous, decline in enrollment, and you haven't made all the adjustments. Not to say that they should or shouldn't, but sometimes those adjustments take time, and it takes more of an aggregate change before they happen.
So before we move on to, I'm going to make this, what do we hope to learn, not what did we learn? Any other data that we think we should review?
And I'm sure that there are sort of ways to say, wouldn't it be great to know this or that, but some of it is just wishful thinking because the data simply doesn't exist.
I wonder if this is specific to governance, if there's a look at spending at a central office level. And so we're looking at that change over time and looking at the difference in spending SU level versus district level. Again, I know they're different entities, but I think those are important. Again, there are narratives out there, right, that for some reason SUs are inefficient, but they may be more efficient in some cases. And so I know that's hard to parse that out sometimes when you look at a single district budget. Everything's included in a single district budget, but you can figure out, what are, business office costs, what are, superintendent costs, curriculum director costs. You can separate those things out by function and object codes. So I think it would be helpful to have spending at a central office level versus spending in terms of direct instruction.
Unfortunately, this can't probably be gathered, but in that same question is, educational leadership time and how it is divided. How much in an SU is spent on board management versus an SD. Whether that's good or bad, I also couldn't judge either. But I don't think that data exists. It would just be fascinating to know.
Yeah, but it may be data worth collecting, right? It doesn't exist now, but it may be something in the next 5 months that we work on and work with the agency on to solicit from our, respective SUs and SDs. I agree, Peter. I think, those are part of the trade-offs, right? And what are the values in those trade-offs, as long as people understand the difference.
And I bet the underlying data does exist because, again, I mean, like, we get apportioned our cost of like our superintendent's salary based on, the number of hours that she spends helping us. So I would think that the raw data is there. Maybe it's just never been compiled.
Yeah, I would say, Jen, from my experience, it's not some data that I would have kept a log of or kept track of, but there is a certain element of board management and board communication that happens in an SU that is more time consuming, I would suspect, than an SD. Some of that may obviously depend on size, right? Size of an SU, size of an SD. I mean, being a superintendent of a single district with a single school, that's very different than a district that might have, 8 schools or 9 schools, right? And so again, all of those mechanisms I think are important to understanding the difference in governance and the trade-offs, right? So for everything you do, there's something you're not doing. And so what are we trading off? What are the benefits of, local boards and an SU and all of that versus, having a single superintendent with a single board and all of that, depending on committee structures and size and all of that. And that's the kind of data that I think would be helpful. It would probably take a deep dive and somebody to be hired to analyze that kind of and do that kind of study. And some of it would be qualitative as well as quantitative. But again, to the extent that we might be able to ask the field some of that information, I certainly think we could.
Do you all think that we need to go through the question of what do we hope to learn, or is that kind of embedded in the articulation of what data we're hoping to get?
I think it's embedded. And we definitely need to leave some time for question 4.
Right. So should we pivot to question 4?
Yeah.
Okay, so that one is measure benefits and burdens, and the specific question that we are charged with is how does the proposed policy seek to enhance services and or reduce disparities to underrepresented or underserved communities? And policy, I mean, is this, I'm remembering that this committee was charged with looking at basically 3 different models, which question, I'm not sure that that's still relevant because I don't think anyone is pushing the governor's 5-district proposal anymore. So I'm not sure that we need to spend time on that.
Well, yeah, I did sort of say, well, what proposed policy are they? Does the question assume? And I think we could probably say we could probably just go with the assumption fewer districts or fewer SUs.
So shall we change the question to how does reducing the number of districts seek to enhance services and or reduce disparities?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, and I think attached to that, even more importantly, although not really a governance thing, is foundation formula funding.
Okay.
Which I
so
think, which I do think does seek to reduce disparities.
So how does reducing the number of districts and shifting to a foundation formula seek to enhance services and or reduce disparities to underrepresented or underserved communities?
It depends.
It's complicated.
I mean, it depends on the base amount, depends on the weighting, right? And so how much we're weighting for poverty, how much is there, and I know in the current H454, small schools is not part of the weighting. That's a separate block grant or certain separate amount that would be established. And I haven't really studied that to understand how it works or doesn't work or the pros and cons of it. So I think this is a fundamental question, right? I understand, certainly what you've been wrestling with in House Ed, as well as Ways and Means, trying to figure out how do we provide a more equitable funding formula, given that some school districts spend substantially more, some are spending substantially less. I'm assuming that is maybe some level off, right? So there's a ceiling, right? So the people are not spending above a certain amount, but then there's a floor, right? So that you're not spending below a certain amount, so that there's more equity in the resources available. I think the other variable to this is spending above the foundation formula, right? And to what extent do communities have that ability to do that, which concerns me with the disposition of certain communities, right? So it may not necessarily be, well, I guess it does depend on their resource if they're spending above the base amount. But sorry about the hound dog in the background. That's just all of us in the kingdom. We all have hound dogs. So, but I'll go off mic for now.
So I would just picking up on that. I do think that a foundation formula is designed for that, but moving towards governance, I think one of the reasons of having larger districts and fewer districts is to provide some grand list equity that sort of speaks to what John was bringing up, sort of the capacity of districts to raise more money if that is allowed, but also trying to equalize to a certain extent the ability of each district to raise additional funds if that's allowed under the law.
Yeah, and similar to Act 46, some of this depends on that aggregation of those districts, right? So we could just have one much larger single district that still has low property values, right? So versus a much larger district in a more affluent area of the state. And so those are places where I worry that we may not entirely solve things. It may be regional differences as opposed to now district differences. That things like categorical aid that can be more directed. So I think these are the right questions, and the questions I know that the legislature is wrestling with. It just gets interesting when you create boundaries. Who's in and who's not, right? And what property wealth exists, what debt service exists, those kinds of things. So joining partners may be a benefit to somebody and it may be a liability to somebody, right? Because you're taking on their tax burden that you don't have, right? And that's part of the challenge, right? That how we split up those resources. But I think it's the modeling of all of that that's so important. And so as we start to look at hypothetical district boundaries, what does that mean? There's going to be some leveling up of salaries, and we're not going to level down, but there may be some threshold that keeps those salaries from growing too much.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right in the sense that it does depend. I think that if you go to sort of a cost basis as is being proposed for a foundation formula, you really are reducing disparities within communities, because essentially it's not based on where you live, it's based on the student that you're educating. And of course it does depend on the weights as well.
Yeah, and some of that was obviously the goal of 127, right? We increased weighting, but the weighting didn't necessarily guarantee increased resources, right? And increased resources meaning funding would presumptuously be that you have more programs and services, right? But some communities we know take the tax benefit, right, of increased weighting. And so that's still the question about, even in a foundation formula, whether the weighting is being directed towards the needs is still a question. Yes. I mean, whereas categorical aid is obviously much more directed.
Yeah. I think what you're saying is that you can have a generous foundation formula with generous weights, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that the money that's attached to that student is targeted at that individual student.
Yeah, that's the hope, that those increased resources give a district the ability to provide programs and services to meet students that are struggling, often due to their socioeconomic background. And again, not to say that in a disparaging way or universally, but typically communities that have higher poverty have higher special ed numbers and higher needs for students.
And I feel like I'm stating the obvious here, but how does the proposed policy seek to enhance services and or reduce disparities? I mean, I think the hope is by shifting to a foundation formula that we would have increased educational opportunities for students as well as increased supports for students who need them. So, put that out there.
That's the hope. Again, all this depends on the amount, and then is there the ability to spend above what's available in the foundation formula? Again,
But
without modeling, it's hard to know, right?
going to our specific charge, which is governance, how do we ensure, or how do we do our best to ensure that those who are governing newer, bigger districts are operating with, all of those assumptions in mind, that the money needs to go to the students, that the weights are attached to, and all of that. And, to me, the sort of the challenge of governance of these larger districts is going to be one of the big challenges that we have to figure out next year. Is what size is the school board? Are they semi-professional? How do we best sort of keep it as apolitical as possible? Because they're going to be in control of a significant amount of money and how that money is spent.
Yeah, and assuming larger districts have proportional representation, communities that have a larger voice on a board are potentially